Ever since I was a kid, I have loved Pokemon. I had the trading cards, I had the link cable, I even had that plastic Pokeball that never stayed clipped to your belt. I watched the anime every single day after school. I always picked Bulbasaur, even though my friends were always gonna pick Charmander and kick my ass, but I didn't care. But if you're like me, you probably have a question. How is it that the most profitable media franchise of all time, I'm talking over $100 billion in trading cards, TV show deals, and movies, is putting out games that look like this? I am not here to dunk on Pokemon. I grew up with the games. I love them. I want it to be amazing. But as I started digging into this question, really digging into how these games are made, I realized this isn't just a situation of lazy devs and tight deadlines. There is a much deeper story here. And the more I learned, the more I started to understand how it all became inevitable. So in this video, I want to walk you through the key decisions, timelines, and people of the rise and gradual erosion of one of the most beloved franchises in gaming. What the f happened to Most people assume a massive corporation engineered Pokemon, but in reality, it was just a kid who really liked bugs. Satoshi Tajiri grew up in the suburbs of Tokyo in the 1970s. He spent most of his childhood hanging out in the forest collecting insects, earning him the nickname Dr. Bug from his friends. When arcades started popping up, Tajiri became obsessed with video games. He began publishing a game fanzine called Game Freak with his friend and illustrator Ken Sugimori. Eventually, they decided to turn this fanzine into a game development studio. And then in the early 90s, Tajiri pitched an idea to Nintendo. A Game Boy RPG where players could collect creatures and trade them using a link cable. It was a weird idea, but eventually Nintendo said yes. Development was extremely difficult. The team had no formal programming background, minimal funding, and no stable pipeline. At one point, development stalled so badly that only 3 people remained on the project: Tajiri, Sugimori, and Junichi Masuda, who handled the music and coding. He's going to be very important soon, so make sure you remember him. Matsuda later recalled, "The game was really buggy and barely running. We didn't know if we were gonna be able to ship it." But in 1996, Pokemon Red and Green shipped in Japan. At first, it just seemed like a clever RPG. You catch monsters, trade with your friends, and battle your rival. But that simple loop was clearly hiding something much bigger. Because underneath all of the code, Pokemon was a social system.
You can't catch all 150 Pokemon by yourself.
So close.
You need a friend to trade with.
The Red and Green version both had its own exclusive creatures, so the only way to finish your collection was to trade with someone else. And then with this game primed to explode, that's when Mew happened. The 151st Pokemon, Mew, was hidden in the game's code and was never meant to be found, but someone did find it. And word spread like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone was trying to figure out how they could catch Mew for themselves. Some kids said you could find them by moving a truck near the SS Anne, or by beating the Elite Four 100 times. Or some people also thought if you completed your Pokedex and sent the cartridge to Nintendo, they would send the cartridge back with Mew. And of course, none of that was true. But it didn't matter, because what Mew proved is that this game had secrets. And maybe that kid that lived next door to you knew something that you didn't. That's what made Pokemon explode. The sense that the world was bigger than what was on the screen. And the only way to unlock it was each other. Combined with Blue, a later first generation release, these first generation games would go on to sell over 10 million copies in Japan. The US release came 2 years later, with Red and Blue launching in September of 1998. And the impact was immediate. Pokemon Red and Blue sold over 4 million copies in the North Americas in their first year alone. The anime also aired in syndication and became an overnight success. There were school bands, collectors were losing their minds trying to find the rarest cards, and resale markets were popping up all over the country. In July 1998, Pokemon the First movie premiered in Japan. It wouldn't hit US theaters until November 1999.
The marketing blitz is on for the new Pokemon movie.
But when it did, it premiered at #1 and eventually grossed over $172 million. It was official. Pokemania was here.
If you guys don't know what Pokemon is, you're in need of some serious remedial toy education.
They're not allowed at our school because it's such a craze and people like them so much they tend to steal.
So far this year, sales of trading cards, toys, and video games surpassed $500 million in the U.S. Another $4 billion was sold overseas.
In my opinion, parents should not let their kids watch Pokemon, play Pokemon, buy Pokemon cards, have anything whatsoever to do with Pokemon, because the message is violence.
Hasbro, one of Nintendo's 100 U.S. licensees, is still fighting to keep up with demand, even after boosting production capacity 20 times.
School officials are finding that Pokemon cards are responsible for fistfights, and the constant trading is not only distracting kids from classwork, but turning the playground into a black market.
We expect this to probably be the biggest success in the toy industry's history.
Burger King is running its biggest toy promotion ever, featuring 57 Pokemon toys over 56 days. They're still going strong after nearly 4 years in Japan, and Nintendo plans to roll out 100 new characters next fall.
By the end of 1999, US Pokemon merch sales would exceed $1 billion in the US alone. Globally, the franchise had already crossed $5 billion in total revenue, and by the early 2000s, it would surpass $15 billion, solidifying its place as the most successful media franchise of its time. As the franchise exploded in popularity, Tajiri stepped away from the day-to-day development and shifted into more of a supervisory role. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight and was never interested in running a media empire, but he continued to serve as executive producer, while creative control eventually passed to Junichi Masuda. Remember him? Now, before stepping back fully, Tajiri helped oversee one more mainline project, Pokemon Gold and Silver.
You live to catch Pokemon, but 150 aren't enough. Get ready for the next step. On October 15th, Pokemon Gold and Silver will arrive.
Released in November 1999 in Japan and October 2000 in North America, Gold and Silver debuted on the Game Boy Color, leveraging its expanded memory and limited color palette to create a much richer world than the originals. And they innovated on new features like breeding, a real-time day and night cycle, and held items, and access to 2 new regions, Johto and Kanto, which effectively doubled the game's scope. The titles would go on to sell over 23.7 million copies worldwide, solidifying the franchise as a permanent fixture in global pop culture. At the time, some within Game Freak saw Gold and Silver as a natural end to the story, a complete arc from beginning to end. But by then, Pokemon was no longer a fun creative project. It was a global business, a machine. And machines don't stop just because their creators are finished. By the time Gold and Silver wraps up, Pokemon is one of the most profitable brands in the world. The franchise is firing on all cylinders. Fans are going crazy, and Satoshi has stepped away and Masuda is now running the show. And if Tajiri was the spark of Pokemon, Masuda became the engine. And he had been there from the beginning, writing music, coding battle systems, sleeping at his desk to keep Red and Green from collapsing. And now on top of composing tracks and coding, he was directing the games. His first full directorial role was on Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, released in Japan in 2002 and worldwide in 2003. New region, new Pokemon, new hardware. The franchise's first real test without its original creator at the helm. And by most metrics, it worked. Ruby and Sapphire sold 16.2 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling Game Boy Advance games of all time. It introduced systems like abilities and double battles, systems that still define competitive play almost 2 decades later. Masuda, speaking to Nintendo Dream in 2003, explained his approach. I wanted to retain the simplicity and accessibility of the series while making sure the depth was there for players who were ready for it. Now, despite the global success, Game Freak did not scale up. They weren't hiring hundreds of new staff. They weren't building big teams or outsourcing major features. They kept using the same in-house tools. Masuda believed that smaller teams made better games, and for a while, that worked. Fire Red and Leaf Green, remakes of the original Gen 1 games, sold more than 12 million copies, more than most full releases. The anime entered its advanced generation arc. Pokemon cards reached 14 billion units sold worldwide by 2005. Everything around the games was evolving, but the games were struggling to keep up. And that brings up a really interesting question. Who is behind all this massive growth at Pokemon? Or better yet, What? In 1998, the Pokemon Company, also known as TPC, was officially formed as a joint venture between Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. Its job wasn't to create the games. In fact, they didn't have anything to do with the games. It was to turn Pokemon into a global juggernaut. That means the anime, the trading cards, the movie, licensing, global merch, everything. At the top of that machine was a man named Sunikazu Ishihara. He didn't have anything to do with Game Freak's development team, but now he was in charge of running the company's business. And that's where things started to change. Pokemon stopped becoming a video game series. It became a coordinated global product launch system. A new game no longer meant a new adventure. It meant trading cards, anime seasons, plushies, shirts, cereal boxes, app integrations, and movie tie-ins all at once. On paper, Game Freak still ran development. And on most accounts, including Masuda himself, Game Freak was never forced to release on anyone else's deadline, contrary to popular belief. But once a release date for the game was chosen, TPC is going to sync its entire marketing machine to that day. So delays were not impossible, but they always came at a cost. That creates pressure, not always explicit, but always present. And Game Freak still wasn't scaling up to meet that challenge. They still had small teams. They still used custom internal tools. They saw themselves as an indie developer inside a billion-dollar ecosystem. And here's the thing, at that point, the games weren't even the most profitable part of the franchise. All the merchandise were the real cash cows. But the games, they were the kickoff, the narrative anchor, the thing that gave the rest of the franchise something to orbit around. And that disconnect, that the least financially crucial part of Pokemon was the one carrying the most creative weight, would become more and more visible as time went on. Then came Diamond and Pearl.
Ready to catch, battle, and trade.
The first mainline Pokemon titles developed for the Nintendo DS. With more memory, dual screens, and a built-in Wi-Fi, the hardware promised a generational leap. And fans expected the games to rise to meet that. And at first glance with Diamond and Pearl, it seemed like they had. Sprites were more animated, menus were more polished, and for the first time, players could trade over the internet via Wi-Fi. But beneath the surface, very little had still changed. Game Freak was still working on tools that they had originally developed for the Game Boy era. The team remained relatively small and development wasn't significantly outsourced in any way. And production processes hadn't evolved to meet the growing complexity of modern games. Diamond and Pearl sold over 17.6 million copies, but they shipped with noticeable issues. Sluggish performance, long save times, and a surprising lack of polish for what was now a global mega franchise. Even Pokemon Platinum, which many fans still regard as the definitive version of the generation, felt more like a refinement than a reinvention. Meanwhile, the rest of the industry was accelerating. The Legend of Zelda began experimenting with large-scale exploration. Monster Hunter was pioneering online co-op with handhelds. And Super Mario had reimagined its core gameplay multiple times across multiple consoles. But Pokemon was still following the same playbook. Still turn-based, still grid-bound, still relying on the same progression structure since Red and Blue. Now, to Masuda, this wasn't a problem. He believed in focus and in simplicity, and in tight narrative design. Now, to be fair, Masuda's focus on small teams and disciplined design had carried Game Freak further than most of these games I'd mentioned previously combined. It's not like it wasn't working. And they brought the world's most popular RPG into a new hardware generation without losing its core identity. But the world around them was changing. Games were getting bigger, development was getting more complex, and players' expectations are growing more ambitious. Pokemon never really had a lot of time to just be a small, fun, handheld RPG. It quickly became the beating heart of a billion-dollar media empire, with timelines, tie-ins, and global rollouts that all depend on the games to pull through. And Game Freak, like I've said multiple times, is still building things the way they always had. By the time Generation 5 arrived, Pokemon was firing on all cylinders. The games continued to launch like clockwork, the anime was well into its rhythm, and the Pokemon cards, especially in the West, were popping off. On the surface, everything was working as intended. Releases were predictable, reliable, and profitable. Then came Pokemon Black and White. Released in 2010, these were the first games in a while that felt like they had something to prove. Game Freak took some real risks this time. The Pokédex was made up of entirely new creatures. The story leaned into much heavier themes, exploring ideas like morality, control, and the ethical implications of training Pokemon in the first place. For a series that had largely stuck to tradition, this was a bold step into unfamiliar territory. For some players, especially older ones, it felt like Pokemon had started to grow up a bit. But for others, they weren't so sure. To some, the designs felt divisive, the tone was unfamiliar, and some fans struggled to connect with a region that felt deliberately isolated from what came before. Critically, the games performed well, but commercially, this marked Pokemon's first dip. Combined sales for Black and White reached about 15.6 million units, strong by any measure, but noticeably down for the 17.7 million units sold from Diamond and Pearl. But to their credit, Game Freak adjusted quickly. Their follow-up, Black and White 2, walked things back. It reused the same engine, brought older Pokemon back much earlier, and refocused in on tried and true post-game content. The game was more refined and more balanced in many ways, but they played it safe. The boldness that had defined the originals was dialed down in favor for something more familiar. Now that shift, which is subtle at first, starts becoming more of a pattern later on. The games would keep coming, the machine would keep turning, but something fundamental had changed about how the company approached growth, risk, and experimentation. Then came X and Y in 2013.
Discover a breathtaking 3D world.
Pokemon's first full step into 3D. This was supposed to be the big one, the first global launch in franchise history. The first time that battles had real motion and depth. The first time that 3D models were replacing sprites. The new region, Kalos, was vibrant and distinctly European. And with the introduction of Mega Evolutions, it gave older Pokemon a chance to get some new forms and have some sort of modern relevance. The online systems were upgraded, the visuals looked pretty slick, and branding was everywhere. And on paper, Nintendo made it look like a milestone. And yet, in practice, it felt a little unfinished. The new region, while looking pretty nice, felt empty. The story set up something big, but it didn't really feel interested in finishing it. New systems were introduced, like the Friend Safari and Sky Battles, but none of them really stuck the landing. Now, the game wasn't exactly a mess, but to some fans, it felt like the game had been pushed out a little early before it had a chance to grow. X and Y sold 16.7 million copies, slightly up from Gen 5, but not by much. And for the first 3D entry in the series, it was a strong number, but not the explosive leap that everyone was expecting. And inside Game Freak, once again, not a lot had changed. They were still under 200 developers at the time, but the pace was now starting to pick up. Just 1 year after the release of X and Y, Game Freak released Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which were remakes of the Gen 3 classics, but rebuilt in the same engine. The changes were mostly visual. A few systems were modernized, the world was upgraded to 3D, but structurally it was safe. And deliberately so. The remake sold 14.6 million copies. Then came Sun and Moon, and for the first time in years, the formula changed in a meaningful way. There were no gyms, there were no badges, there was no Elite Four in the traditional sense. Instead, players took on island trials, compact story-driven challenges that focused more on character and theme more than raw type matchups. The Alola region felt more distinct. It felt more like a culture, not just a setting that they slapped in the games. Cutscenes became more expressive. The narrative leaned harder into emotion. Even Pokemon themselves reflected this shift through regional forms that gave old designs new personality. The designs weren't just for function. They were playful, they were fun, they were intentional. It felt like the team at Game Freak was rediscovering what made Pokemon exciting in the first place. And the audience noticed. Sun and Moon became the fastest selling Pokemon games in Nintendo's history at the time. Of course, the games themselves weren't flawless, but they carried a creative spark that had been missing for a while. It felt like finally, maybe Pokemon was ready to evolve. Pun intended. Then came Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon just 1 year later. Same region, same characters, nearly the same story. There were additions, but to some, it wasn't enough to justify a full release. What felt like at first a bold step forward suddenly felt like a timid step sideways. When Pokemon finally landed on the Switch in 2019, a lot of fans expected it to be different. This is the first time the mainline series would be launched on a proper home console, not on a handheld with technical ceilings, but a hybrid with some real decent power behind it. Maybe this is the one where Pokemon finally grows up. And that game was Sword and Shield.
Your journey to become a Pokemon champion starts here.
At first glance, it looked like a step forward. The Galar region had personality. The music was strong. The wild area opened up things in ways that felt new. I wouldn't call it a reinvention, but it definitely felt like a move in the right direction. But it wasn't perfect. The Pokédex had been cut. Hundreds of familiar Pokemon had been missing from the launch version of the game. When fans asked why, the response was vague. So people started digging. Data miners pulled animation files. YouTubers ran side-by-side comparisons with the 3DS games. And they found that a lot of the assets had been reused. A lot of the animation walk cycles were reused. A lot of the models were reused. And that's when the hashtag took off. Game Freak lied. What started as frustration from the audience quickly turned into something that Game Freak had never faced before: organized backlash. There were boycott calls, canceled pre-orders, viral threads. For a franchise known for being slow and safe, this was new territory. And at the center of it all was poor Junichi Masuda. He put out a formal statement, and it was soft, careful, and non-specific. There was a promise that more Pokemon would return in future games, but by that point, the tone of the conversation had already shifted. Fans weren't just disappointed at the games, they were starting to question the studio itself. What if Game Freak can't handle this anymore? Now, you would think that because of this, Sword and Shield would have been a disaster. But despite all of this, Sword and Shield sold over 25 million copies. It became one of the best-selling Pokemon games of all time. But the relationship with the audience was different now, wasn't it? The game still worked, but that wasn't the problem. What hit harder was the realization that Pokemon might never become what the fans hoped it would. And this is where I want to note something interesting. While the mainline games were starting to narrow in scope, they were playing it safer, hitting their marks, the stranger ideas, the more experimental stuff started showing up somewhere else. In the spin-offs. Pokemon Snap, which I used to play for hours and hours and hours in my local McDonald's, focused on photography instead of battles. Same with Stadium, which attempted 3D battles before the mainline games even thought about using it. Mystery Dungeon spun off into roguelike storytelling with surprising emotional weight. And then there was Pokemon Go, which sparked one of the most insane and chaotic cultural phenomena that I have ever experienced in my entire life.
Dragonite! Dragonite! There's a Vaporeon that spawned right there, so everyone's running.
I really want to dig more into Pokemon Go and all of the madness that happened during that time, but I don't think I have time to do that in this video, so it's going to get its own video, so make sure that you subscribe for when that one comes out. None of these games were made by Game Freak. They were built by outside studios on different timelines with different goals. And because of that, maybe they had room to be weird. They could try something. They could fail. They could hit on something fresh without having to align with some kind of anime arc or a card drop or like a merchandising campaign. Now, not all of them worked, but the ones that did, especially Pokemon Go, left a massive mark on the culture. Pokemon Go alone pulled in over $6 billion in revenue. That's more than most mainline generations combined. And whether fans realized it or not, this was becoming the pattern. When Pokemon felt fresh, it often wasn't coming from the main series. By the time Sword and Shield wrapped, something had shifted inside of Game Freak. Junichi Masuda, who had directed or co-directed nearly every mainline game since the beginning, stepped back from the director's chair. He remained involved as a producer, but creatively his era was winding down. For the first time in decades, the studio's leadership was opening up, and a younger generation of developers began stepping into leadership roles. Out of that transition came a game that at first looked like a spin-off, Pokemon Legends Arceus. It didn't follow the usual format. There were no dual versions, no global launch campaign, no synchronized anime or card set. Marketing was relatively modest by Pokemon standards, and for many fans it appeared to be a side experiment, positioned somewhere between a mainline game and a tech demo. But inside Game Freak, Arceus represented something more serious, a genuine attempt to rethink the formula. Set in a feudal era version of Sinnoh, the game reimagined the player as not a champion to be, but as a researcher. There were no gyms, no rivals, no Elite Four, but instead, your job was to observe Pokemon behavior, document it, and gradually build the first Pokédex. Kind of a cool concept. Encounters felt different. Pokemon freely wandered the world. You could sneak up on them, toss Pokeballs by hand, or you could even get ambushed if they spotted you. It was faster, more reactive, and fundamentally more immersive. Now, visually, Arceus was severely limited. Environments were sparse, animations were limited. The texture quality and draw distance were so bad that it became a meme overnight. Now, we know that they were trying something new, but the problem is it didn't look like it came from the IP of the most profitable franchise on the planet. But players did notice something else. the ideas under the surface. Reviewers called it a rough draft of something exciting. Critics pointed to the dated visuals, but praised the boldness of the design. IGN gave it a 7 out of 10, calling it a surprisingly fun and engaging Pokemon experience. And sales-wise, it beat expectations, shipping out over 14.8 million copies within a year. And maybe more importantly, Legends Arceus had sparked something that the fans hadn't been doing for years. They were talking about the game like they were excited again. It wasn't perfect, but it was brave, and it didn't come from the usual names. Arceus was directed by Kamizawa Iwao and composed by a team of developers who had been working behind the scenes for years. Whether Arceus signaled a new direction or was simply an outlier remains to be seen at this point. But for a brief moment, the Pokemon formula cracked wide open. By the time Scarlet and Violet was preparing to launch in 2022, Game Freak had already weathered one of its most intense periods in the franchise's history. In just 3 years, they had rolled out Sword and Shield, 2 DLC expansions, remade Diamond and Pearl, and released Pokemon Legends Arceus. And now they were tasked with building something even bigger, building the first fully open world Pokemon game. Following the experimental success of Arceus, Scarlet and Violet marked the return of Shigeru Omori, Game Freak's mainline director since Sun and Moon. He wasn't new to the role, but this time the expectations were higher than ever. But Omori's task was not to experiment. It was to deliver the first open world Pokemon game with 3 branching storylines, online co-op, and all under intense deadlines and aging hardware. The marketing plan was in motion. The anime schedule was locked. The trading card rollout had been finalized. November was the release date, and they did not want to push it back under any cost. So the team at Game Freak did what they always do. They got the game ready as best as they could. And when the deadline arrived, they released it. The issues were immediate. Players encountered broken animations, frame rate drops, characters freezing in cutscenes, and visual bugs that range from hilarious to game-breaking. Unlike the previous series, this isn't something that fans could chalk up to just nitpicking. The problems of this game were widespread and obvious. Even the most casual players, people who have never followed a development cycle in their life and had no idea of any of this drama that was going on with this community and doesn't care, even they could tell that something was wrong. Clips exploded on social media. Entire threads were dedicated to glitches and performance breakdowns. And then something strange happened. Nintendo apologized. Not Game Freak, not the Pokemon Company, but Nintendo itself. The most silent and controlled of the trio acknowledged the backlash and promised updates. Now, to many fans, this felt like a small victory, but to those who had been paying attention, this wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable result of a pattern that had been building for a long time. Because this wasn't just about Scarlet and Violet, was it? This was about everything else that had came before it. The shrinking development cycles, the growing scope of each project, the studio that hadn't scaled its size with its ambitions. And when you actually sit with the game, you could really feel this pressure. The world is expansive, but it often feels underdeveloped. With Scarlet and Violet, there are some brilliant ideas that are trying to push through here, but they don't quite land just because they weren't given the space to refine them. Now, I want to say this was never about blaming developers. It still isn't. They're doing their best, and they clearly love this world that they're building. But they're operating inside a system that doesn't prioritize readiness, it prioritizes deadlines. Now, once again, you probably think that this destroyed the Pokemon franchise and they barely made any sales, right? Right? Scarlet and Violet sold 10 million copies in 3 days. It became the fastest selling Pokemon game in history, and one of the best-selling Nintendo games of all time. The bugs didn't stop it. The criticisms didn't slow it down. Even Nintendo's apology didn't have an ounce of impact on the outcome. And for fans, I think that's what hurt the most. Not the glitches, not all the cut content, but true confirmation, once again, that Pokemon didn't even need to be finished anymore. It just needed to ship. So when I first started researching this video, I thought it was just going to be a simple breakdown, like a critique maybe. A look at how the most profitable gaming franchise in history kept stumbling. But this is all just preamble, because the deeper I went, the more I realized this real story isn't about what Game Freak was building. It's about what I found 1,000 times more interesting was what the fans were building instead. Players began to fix things in these games, rework them, and then eventually remake them entirely. Fan-made ROM hacks like Radical Red, Unbound, and Inclement Emerald redesigned entire regions and rebalanced mechanics, added smarter AI, and quality of life features that the games still don't have. These were acts of game design, built from the ground up by people who know what Pokemon used to feel like and wanted to know what else the games could become. Meanwhile, for competitive players, Pokemon Showdown became the real platform. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. And that reliability earned more trust than the mainline games had in years. I didn't really expect to be moved by this part of the story, but I was. Because most of these projects aren't funded. They're not promoted. They're not officially supported. They're made in bedrooms, in spare time, by artists and coders and designers who just care about the game, its mechanics, and the community around it. Some people have been working on these projects for years without recognition. No reward, just belief. So while the official games kept chasing deadlines, fans chased possibility. And looking back at it, that's why this video got made. Because Pokemon hasn't survived all these years just because it had clever marketing or a strong brand. It survived because people kept picking it back up, even when the series didn't give them a reason to. Fans kept it alive by sheer momentum, by memory, by love. Look at some of these remakes. These fans love these games so much that they rebuild them, not to replace the original, but to remind us how special they were in the first place. But I'm also not going to talk about the fact that half of these remakes and rebuilds and ROM hacks that I've mentioned have been taken down by Nintendo. We're not going to talk about how some of the greatest remakes ever made have been shut down by this company. Pokemon Uranium, you will be missed. That's all I'm going to say about that. But despite all of that, I still believe this is where Pokemon's future lives. Not in hardware upgrades or new release cycles, but in the players who believe that there's still something worth building. The ones who remember what it felt like to care, to connect, to explore a world that felt like it was bigger than the screen it was on, because that feeling never really left. It just needs space to grow again. And if there's still a spark somewhere in the code, the stories, or the people behind it, then maybe the best version of Pokemon isn't behind us. Maybe it's still out there, waiting to be caught. Just like a kid chasing bugs in the grass. Not for points, not for profit, just to see what he could find.
CNN Financial News, New York.
Well, I guess no end in sight for Pokemon.
No, there's a lot of money too.
Exactly. That is Moneyline for this Tuesday. I'm Below Band.
I'm Stuart Barney. Thanks for joining us. Good night from New York.